Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into Nature's Returns, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Angela Xue. I'm a first-year Master of Environmental Management student here at Yale School of the Environment, and I will be co-hosting for today's webinar with Marisa Bruno and Sonia Wang, both here at Yale School of the Environment. The Nature's Return webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers in the field of conservation finance to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in the growing field of ecosystem service valuation and investment. Before we begin, we would like to remind our audience that we welcome any questions you might have and will direct them to our speaker. Please type questions directly into the Q&A window throughout the webinar session. And now I will pass it on to Marisa Bruno to kick off today's webinar.
Thanks, Angela. Hi, everyone. My name is Marisa, and I'm a member of the Water Learning Community here at the Yale School of the Environment. The Water Learning Community is a group of students passionate about sustainable water management, both fresh and salty. One of the biggest challenges facing water managers across the United States is water scarcity, both from increased population growth and more intense droughts due to climate change. In water-scarce environments, farmers, cities, and rivers often end up competing for limited water resources. And this is certainly the case in Texas, which, as I'm sure many of you guys have read, is definitely experiencing a population boom now during the pandemic and will continue to see population growth over the next decades. Today, we are so excited to welcome Dr. Quinn McColly, Conservation Finance Director at Texas Water Trade, an organization leveraging the power of markets to restore water to Texas waterways in a way that is beneficial for both nature and people. Quinn brings decades of both practical market and academic experience to his work in Texas, and we are so grateful he agreed to talk about some of these challenges and opportunities for water markets in the state. So with that brief introduction, Quinn, I'll pass it off to you.
Great, thank you, Marissa. I'll see if I can share the screen. If you'd let me know that it's working, that'd be great. Can you see that okay? All right, perfect. My name is Quinn McColly. Thanks for the nice introduction, appreciate it. Super happy to be here. This is work that I have done in an academic setting. So from the theoretical, my dissertation revolved around using artificial intelligence to come up with ways that we can work water price models into the equation. And from there, I've kind of segued into more of a role as a practitioner with water trade, where I actually get to affect and execute water transactions in practice. We'll cover a lot of ground today. Super excited to be here. Some of this, many of you may know. Some of it you may not know. My hope is that everybody takes away one thing to at least think about, or one thing that you learned today, and it will be a smashing success. So we'll get right into it. If I can get my pointer to work. There we go. The first thing that kind of got me into water markets, I spent 10 years as a floor trader on the Chicago Stock Exchange, so I'm intimately familiar with markets and their function. One interesting thing about water is it's something that was noted by Adam Smith way back in 1776 when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And this is really, from an economist viewpoint, kind of a nightmare called a paradox of value. Water is arguably the most valuable substance on the planet, yet we give it away virtually for free, whereas a diamond, accepting some industrial applications and potentially in the West, if you want to get married, has very limited practical value, yet commands a very high market value. How do we reconcile these two things? How is it that we are giving away our most priceless substance for free, and substances that are of limited value command a high market price? That is a very difficult thing to reconcile when you begin to think about water markets. For example, when it's raining, the value might be zero because you can walk outside and collect it. But if you are in the desert, it is surely priceless. So that's one of the things that really intrigued me about water markets and the development of water markets. So I'd like to really think through how we can improve the valuation of water as a resource. And that's something that markets can help us do. So why markets in general? The first reason is that historically markets have been the best mechanism to efficiently allocate scarce goods and resources. Also, what makes our democracy work? Participation, right? We vote. It's a participatory environment. What makes markets work? Participation. When you have many buyers and sellers present in a marketplace, you generally tend to have better, efficient pricing of your whatever resources that is. And that means if we can develop markets for water, efficient markets for water that encourage that participation, democratize access to the resource. A lot of the work that Texas Water Trade does revolves around providing water for the environment, be that riparian benefits or in-stream flows to our bays and estuaries. And if we want the environment or people who represent the environment to be able to be a player at the table, we need mechanisms in place that allow this democratization of access to happen. So why water, why in Texas? One thing climatologists generally tend to agree on is that variability is increasing. Markets as a tool generally tend to be some of our most adaptive tools when it comes to dealing with scarcity. As we think towards the future and increased variability, the tools that we can nurture that can deal with that variability the best are going to be of the most utility to us moving forward. And markets historically have been very good at that. Also, interestingly to me anyway, in Texas, when Powell did his survey of the Southwest West, he noted that the 99th parallel is the line that demarcates the arid West and the moist East. And he used the 20 inches of precipitation. Generally, 20 inches of precipitation is what you need to support unirrigated agriculture, and you have that east of the line. West of the line, you generally need to have supplemental irrigation to make your agricultural efforts pay. Lately, we have noticed that that dry line has been trending to shift to the east. In a state like Texas and for the West generally, that means that it is becoming drier. And as it becomes drier, we're going to see scarcity increase, which means we really need access to the tools that will help us move this resource to where we need it the most. Also, from an economic standpoint, water is very interesting because there is no substitute. If you're cooking an omelet and you're using olive oil and you run out, you might use vegetable oil or something else. But when it comes to water, there is no substitute. So it has some unique properties. And also, it's important to remember that regardless of where this dry line is, when we have low flow or drought conditions in our bays and estuaries, human needs upstream persist. We are still going to withdraw the amount of water that we need to function, particularly from our surface water or our groundwater supplies, which imperils our environmental flows in these rough times. So a lot of what water trade does is try to secure the water that will, I can't just say salinity in an entire bay, but I might be able to procure enough water that I can provide refugia at the head of the bay for migratory birds, for the fish hatchery, so that our recovery times coming out of these low flow or drought conditions might be a little quicker than they would be without some supplemental help. In Texas, one thing that's very interesting about how we manage our water is the division between surface water and groundwater. The two are managed separately and they have very different management rules that apply. Surface water rights, prior appropriation. This is the old first in time, first in right approach. If your great-great-grandfather dug a canal a year before my great-great-grandfather, then in perpetuity, you will receive your water, your allocation of water before I do, and then provided there's enough water left in the system, I will get mine filled. Groundwater works by the same rule that oil and gas capture does, the rule of capture. If you can drill it and you can find it and you can extract it, then you own it. Texas Commission on Environmental Quality manages surface water rights. They hold the water rights in trust for the people of the state of Texas, and then they administer those rights to applicants. Generally, it is accepted that almost all, if not all, of the basins are oversubscribed, which means there are more permits out than water exists to fill them all. Groundwater typically is managed by groundwater conservation districts. It's a bit of a misnomer. In Texas, our groundwater supplies are actually being planned for planned depletion over time. How long will it take us to run to zero? So a more accurate term might be groundwater depletion districts. However, they are called groundwater conservation districts. From a market standpoint, what is it that is impeding the development or the rollout of markets in Texas? Well, there are regulatory impediments. There are certain rules in place that make it very difficult to transfer water between basins. For example, one is the junior rights provision, where if you are in Basin A and you have your water right with the date stamp of, say, 1940, which makes it a pretty senior water right, if you sell or transfer that water to an adjoining basin, your water right, regardless of its initial date, now becomes the most junior water right in the receiving basin. So there's it really is a detriment to encouraging people to trade water across basins, because you lose all your senior rights. That certainly is a barrier to entry, but there are other administrative barriers to entry. When I was doing my doctoral research in Australia, I met one water attorney, and that water attorney had actually decided to become a water broker. They administer all their water through a market-based system. And so it really reduces the amount of legal requirements involved in buying and selling water. In Texas, if somebody asked me or approached me about the possibility of buying a water right and what that would look like, the first thing I would do would be recommend that they hire a lawyer. Understanding that people come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, just that administrative barrier alone can prevent people from engaging in water transactions. Also, it is very difficult for us to think in terms of a water market that might encompass the state, because Texas is vast. It is very big. And as a result of being so big, we have remember the dry line from the previous slide? We have a good section of the state, particularly say over by Houston, that has more water than it knows what to do with. And then we have parts of the state in the west that are very arid, like the Chihuahuan Desert. When we think about the paradox of value, how can we reconcile market valuations across the state, where in one part of the state, it's likely to be close to zero or very low value, and in another part of the state, it's likely to be a very high value. So what can we do? We can change the rules. That some of those rules would require a legislative change, or the second approach is the one that I generally take. We can just forge ahead. I think generally, historically, entrepreneurials have led the way, and then we bring the rule makers and the regulators kicking and screaming kind of after the fact. Once we get to a critical mass or a tipping point of activity where people realize that this is a necessary tool, these are necessary changes that we have to implement and put in place to really increase our efficiency, then we can kind of bring them along. Also, we can facilitate trade where we can, which is something water trade does, and we can engage in education and outreach. When we teach people about the importance of laying the groundwork and setting up good frameworks within which we can operate, that can be an instrument of change. The pendulum swings slowly, but that is certainly a place that we can make progress. And I think probably a good interim step or intermediary step between now and full-fledged statewide or nationwide market is start small and then begin to scale. If we think about micro markets on maybe a basin by basin basis, we get around that junior rights provision. We can have accurate water pricing based on local conditions that make sense. We avoid some of the problems of transmission. We can begin to see these smaller markets kind of take root, and then as they develop and grow, we can interconnect them as needed. How does water trade do this? We're a 503c nonprofit, and here's how we work. We're really not a public-facing institution by mission statement. We understand that there are subject matter experts in local geographies, so we started a water market makers program. We issue a request for proposal, receive proposals, and evaluate those proposals, and then select market makers to be part of this group. If you are selected, you receive from Water Trade 2 years of material support and expertise. You may be an expert in your particular geography's ecology or industrial activity or water budget, but you may not know how to execute a water transaction, where to source the water, how delivery might look, what the regulatory impediments might look like. And we help you through all those questions and find solutions to be able to deliver the water to you that you need for your particular conservation outcome. And then we also have a second program, which is called the Texas Flows Fund, which is a bucket of money that water makers, water market makers, and non-participants, any NGO or organization that is structured to provide environmental outcomes can apply to the Texas Flows Fund. And it's a bucket of money that is specifically dedicated to actually purchase the water for you to reach those conservation outcomes. And with that, I think that's a general background on why these water markets are important, why they're important in the West, in Texas, some of the things that are getting in our way, and how water trade works. At this juncture, I'd ask Marissa, do we have any questions, or do we want to take a minute here and see if there are questions?
Thanks, Quinn. Yeah, I think so. There's one question, which is that water markets are needed in the Western US, in part because of the regulatory environment where water is seen or is allocated based on prior appropriation and rule of capture. So groundwater is kind of seen as private property. Do you see a future where groundwater is in Texas is not regulated as private property, where it's more treated as a public good?
That's a great question, and probably not in my lifetime. We are a state that produces large amounts of oil and gas, and the rule of capture that applies to water also applies in the realm of the oil and gas extraction and collection business. My guess is that oil and gas interests would see any challenge to the rule of capture as an existential threat, and they would do all that they could to stop it. However, there has, for the first time, I think in the maybe not the legislative session that just ended, either this one or the one previous, they did actually form a committee to begin to study the interaction between groundwater and surface water. So people are at least starting to understand that groundwater becomes surface water, becomes groundwater. Yeah, actually, in that last slide, there on the right, that is the Nature Conservancy's Dolan Falls Preserve in West Texas on the Devils River, widely considered the most pristine or one of the most pristine rivers in the state. That water bubbles up from the ground to become the Devil's River. When you look at a phenomena like that, it is difficult to even think that somebody would challenge the idea that the two maybe need to be regulated in a similar fashion, because they are part and parcel the same resource.
And there was another question in the chat about riparian water rights, whether in Texas they grant a quantity of withdrawal, and whether Texas has use it or lose it water rights.
Both excellent questions. We do have a use it or lose it provision. I don't think that the state has ever invoked it once. We would need a change in political will to get that to happen. I think that is one of the sweet spots where we could feasibly see real change happen without requiring a rule change or action by the ledge, because they already have that codified. They just choose not to enforce it. And that I don't know how we choose or impress upon somebody the need to exercise the power that has already been vested in them. But that's an excellent question. We do have it, we don't use it, and I don't think we have ever used it. Maybe it was used one time, actually. Your riparian rights, to the effect that it doesn't affect your downstream user, I believe is the spirit of it, but you still need a permit from TCQ to make that withdrawal. Many of our riparian lands have been owned generationally, so often there's a historic use permit that is involved in that ownership of that land, so it's often a non-event, just based on how ownership has changed hands generation to generation. The use it or lose it question is a real good one. That's really interesting.
And there's another question around water markets, whether they are private markets and how they're allowed to operate without congressional approval.
Hey, that's another great question. Again, I'd point back to Australia. They basically, it started with the two farmers shaking hands over making a water deal. I mean, it's a private property right. You can sell it as you see fit. Formalization takes longer. Even over there, they've been using water markets for 20 years, and it really resembles the Wild West of the NASDAQ, basically, where you've got a bunch of over-the-counter broker-dealers that don't have oversight, and I don't know that it's serving the public good as well as they could. However, you can't encourage regulators to step in and formalize a marketplace until there's enough activity where they think that they need to. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation. Right now, it is small boutique businesses that have access or ownership, and also access to circles of similarly positioned landowners that can steer you to the appropriate places to find a home for your water if you want to sell it, or help you find water if you want to buy it. I think the nature of regulation is that we won't put the dollars into actually formalizing things and regulating it until we get to that kind of critical mass. And I'm not sure how we define that. But that's going to be a real trick as we experience the growing pains of these things starting to take off.
One kind of related question is, with the expansion of water markets, do you see environmental users being a significant player in those markets? Are they going to be the biggest user?
Great question, and it's a double-edged sword. We democratize access. We provide a mechanism for those who would represent the environment to come and buy water. That also very likely means that they will be competing against industrial buyers. When I buy water in the Trinity Basin, particularly around Galveston Bay, if I'm on the east side of the bay and I'm typically co-buying with or competing with agricultural users that farm rice, the price that they can pay for their water is directly related to the price they receive for their crop. I'm generally paying between $25 and $40 an acre foot. An acre, by the way, an acre foot of water, when we talk about acre feet, just to help people conceptualize it. If you think about a football field, it's 100 yards long. If you cut that football field off at the 70-yard line, that's 1 acre. So 1 acre foot is enough water to soak that piece of property 1 foot deep, right? So if I buy 1,000 acre feet, that'd be like up to the 70-yard line, 1,000 feet deep in water. When I buy water on the west side of Galveston Bay, I'm buying it from a different water wholesaler whose main business is selling water to big time industrial users. My cost of water generally triples. So yes, I envision a market where environmental interests can come and buy water. It may facilitate ease of access to the resource, but it also may have some pricing considerations that are painful as we begin to understand how those interactions need to look.
Right. Well, we have a couple other questions, but I think maybe it makes sense to move on to the 2 case studies, and then for the people who still have questions, we'll come back to them in a little bit.
Sure, that's great. And then at least we'll hopefully get through everything today. I know there's a lot to unpack here. The other thing is, when we're doing this work, let's see if I can get my clicker to work. What happens often is that we find problems that we weren't looking for. We've got a big restoration project in West Texas at Comanche Springs, and when we were dealing with local stakeholders, trying to understand the needs of the people and what it might look like to restore the springs, what we heard from both residents and government officials was, yeah, it'd be great if the springs were to flow again, but we really need your help with these abandoned oil and gas wells. We've got about 5,000 abandoned oil and gas wells dotting the Permian Basin that are a result of oil and gas extraction that has taken place over the last 120 years. These wells that you see, I shot that video, are free flowing this groundwater into the desert, and they're often emitting hydrogen sulfide. They are often extremely saline water. Typically, like on the right, that's about 3 times as salty as the ocean. So what we begin to find, I think, when we really start to get at the underbelly of our water challenges, we begin to discover that there are many more problems than necessarily the one that we went out to try to solve in the first place. So while it's important to stay on task and on mission, I think it's also important to encourage our future practitioners to just be aware of what's going on around them, because there are other opportunities to get plugged in and to help. Okay, so we're going to do a couple quick case studies here. These are two projects that Water Trade currently has going on. That is a old postcard of Comanche Springs. Comanche Springs is a desert spring that has flowed for tens of thousands of years, and people, as long as we have been recording history, have been using it as a veritable oasis in the desert. That is a zoomed in view of West Texas. Fort Stockton is the city with the crossroads, and the blue box around Fort Stockton is called Management Zone 1. Management Zone 1 is an irrigation district, and what you find in Comanche is that under the ground it is a karst system, which means the ground is largely sponge-like. So if you pour water into one side of the sponge and it's on, say, a slight incline, it will go all the way through the sponge and come out the other side. Comanche Springs I think it was putting out 30 million gallons a day. It would feed a bunch of farms and ranches just to the east of where Fort Stockton, modern day Fort Stockton, is now. In the 40s and 50s, as agriculture began to get more scaled up to industrial levels, people realized the power of the groundwater pump and began pumping water west of Fort Stockton. When they started to pump west of Fort Stockton and they scaled up their activities, the springs at Comanche stopped flowing for the first time in history. Recently, those springs in the irrigation off season, when the pumps were turned off, began to flow again. So Water Trade wondered, I wonder if we could get the springs to either come back to perennial spring flow, year-round spring flow, or if we could extend the spring flow season by changing water use practices upland that are affecting it. I think most of us have probably heard this, or I usually misquote it pretty poorly, pretty badly, but the sentiment is there. But I think it's not always how long the lever is, it's if we're using the right lever. So in the case of Comanche Springs, how do we meet the needs of the irrigators and also meet the needs of the environment, right? We need to position our solutions so that they serve many stakeholders or serve multiple stakeholders, because then in the Venn diagram of conservation outcomes and agricultural outcomes, we can find the sweet spot in the middle where we can begin to build partnerships and build common ground. This is not a quick process by any means. I'm happy to report that we are on the cusp of putting in place our first forbearance agreement to keep groundwater in place. It's the first of its kind in the irrigation district, the county, and very likely the entire state of Texas. So here's the solution. We go to the farmer and we offer on-farm efficiency improvements funded by us, and the trade becomes for the forbearance. So now the farmer is doing better because she doesn't have to run her pumps as much or as often. And the environment does better because we're getting the conservation outcome we wanted by keeping groundwater in place. To do this, we make sure that science leads the way. Actually, we are on the 8th day of a 14-day pump test right now occurring at the irrigator's location outside of Comanche Springs to better understand aquifer interconnectivity and the connection between the irrigation activity and the spring flow to really quantify what this effect is, so we can begin to understand how much water we need to forbear to get the outcomes that we want. It takes a long time though. This trust building takes a long time, but the multi-party outcomes is really the key that can unlock that door. That's how we're approaching the particular problem with groundwater. In Galveston Bay, which I referenced the prices of water on the east side of the bay and the west side earlier, we've got a pretty big project, and this is using surface water rights. So this is the other side of the coin to kind of give you a feel for how both of these look. What's the challenge in this case? Well, what's the challenge always with environmental issues? The people, right? Without the people, the environment would take care of itself. That's really the issue. As we talked, human needs persist even during drought conditions. So if we think we have it bad and we're under stage 1 restriction for water use or stage 2 restriction for water use, the environment is getting it even worse. And the recovery times coming out of those can be really hampered because there weren't adequate or critical levels of in-stream flows during those difficult times. So in this case, what do? We buy surface water rights for on-demand delivery. We buy the water, we find a landowner who is a willing off-taker of that water so we can store it. That provides migratory bird habitat. And many landowners in Texas anyway are duck hunters, and they see the value of providing good habitat for the migratory birds because they like to go and hunt waterfowl. The trade here is when we see saline conditions in the bay such that we think we need to release some environmental water, the landowner has to pull the plug and let that water flow into the bayou to hopefully affect that salinity regime and provide refugia to the head of the bay or estuary that we're trying to impact. Pretty straight line deal there. Common themes between these two approaches, we need to be willing to think creatively. We have to think about forming partnerships with and coalitions with groups that we might not have ordinarily done business with in the conservation space, because our challenge is, particularly as people continue to flock to the coast and we ramp up industrial activity, these challenges are only going to grow over time. We need to build partnerships. Much of our work involves private landowners, and that trust building takes a long time. So we have to think about playing the long game. And after going through those couple pretty brief case studies, sketch out how we operate. Marissa, I'll see if we have more in the chat or take a break there.
Thanks, Quinn. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the challenge of working with agricultural users.
Yeah, that's really there are many. One is when you approach them and you talk about cost sharing a project or using funding from federal dollars, that trust building that I said is already a lengthy process gets even longer. There is an inherent distrust of accepting they think federal dollars means federal oversight, and to some extent that may be true. And people are kind of wary of attaching those strings to their tractor, as it were. The other thing I think is a really important consideration for us. People get nervous that we're going to come in and lease land and fallow it. I think we need to remember that when we deal with an irrigator, particularly on a large scale, we are not just dealing with that individual farmer. She is part of a farming community, and we really want to respect the fabric of that community and not cause disruptions. And we have to understand that if we begin to take farmland out of production, it affects the person that owns the seed store, the tractor store, even the local mercantile. There is a ripple effect that goes outward and is felt by many more than just the person that we may be cutting a forbearance check to. I think it's good to kind of couch that approach, if you do want to consider fallowing land, is to look for a large player and say, can I buy 10% of your water every year? Or some percentage of the water where there is still enough farming activity going on that it maintains the balance in the community, the economic balance that it took a long time to build.
Okay, yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is that there's a ripple effect of taking farmland out of production, and so you're being careful to avoid that.
100%, right on.
So we have a few other questions coming through. There's a couple around forecasting. So when thinking about the market and predicting market values and how much water you're going to need, how do better forecasts fit into that? And then kind of related, are you also forecasting for climate change and the impacts that would have on the market?
That is an exceptional question. And I probably would be, I could give you a whole nother presentation if you want to understand. All right, here's what happens. When you want to know how much Walmart costs, you just look at the journal, right? Or nowadays, you probably look at your phone and look at how much is a share of Walmart. If you want to know how much is an acre of water foot of water, you can't call the water store because there isn't one. Unless you happen to have a river authority where you want to buy the water, you might be able to get it from them. The work that my academic hat, the reason I was in Australia is I thought maybe we can model water prices, right? So I built a predictive model that takes inputs that are all water dependent commodities, cotton, cattle, sorghum, And then I also incorporate rain as a natural supply driver. And I use that to predict the price of water on the Australian marketplace because they trade it every day real time, just like we trade stocks. I bring the model back here to the United States, volumetrically convert it and make a currency conversion. I run US values in the front and I get a price of water out the back end. That's one approach, like a model transfer approach, at least can get us to a place where we can begin to frame conversations about what the water should be worth. You can predicate it on the value of it to the producer. However, that's a little bit of a dangerous game because your dairy farmer is going to come up with one value and your DAOs of the world are going to say, you know, the dairy farmer can pay $80 an acre foot. DAO or Alcoa or whomever else can probably ultimately pay $750 an acre foot. So there's a real asymmetry of paying price taking ability. And I think we need to be careful of that. In terms of the forecasting, I think generally if we start to rely on production values to help us ascertain the price of water, as those production values are inflation adjusted and scarcity adjusted inherently over time, that will build it in real time. From a forecasting standpoint, it's a little trickier. The state water plan, I think it goes out 50 years is what they use. So it's in the state of Texas anyway, that plan is actually, there's a lot of thought obviously that goes into it, and it's generally pretty well thought out. So for those, generally it's general accepted best practice to rely on the state water plan for those longer range predictions.
And I guess just to kind of bring back in that climate change question, do you see, or when you're having these conversations or planning for these purchases, are you talking about the impacts that climate change might have?
It invariably comes up, although there are still holdouts. So it's safer for me to talk about increasing uncertainty, to talk about the variability piece. And I think that can have a couple of important add-on, value adds, particularly when it comes to dam building. If we continue dam building, we're building dams where there's no guarantee we're going to see the same historic patterns of waterfall or rainfall that we've seen over the last 50 years. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to build permanent structures in the face of growing uncertainty. And that's kind of how I frame it with the potential folks that want to enter into these water contracts is let's think about what gives you the most flexibility when it comes to your future, as opposed to making decisions that put you on one track and lock you into that one track.
Great, thanks, Quinn. There are a couple other questions around policy, but knowing what comes next, I think it makes sense to save them for the end.
Sure, let's see if I can figure out how to do this one more time. All right, great. Only 5 slides left, so we should have a little bit of time left for those last questions and hopefully a little bit of discussion. Okay, this is kind of fun, right? I used to wear my theoretician hat, publish or perish. Now, as a practitioner, it becomes persuade or perish. So how does this look? How does an NGO, and I know a lot of academics, it's like a lot of grant funding and grant funding cycles. How do we make this a sustainable business model to really be the theory of change moving forward, right? Ideally, as an organization, we could be self-sustaining, just as at the Academy. If you have certain research activities going on, you generate some income. For us on the practitioner side, I think maybe we could engage in some business activities surrounding fee for service. We talked about the surface water project in Galveston Bay. I'm super excited about some technology we're deploying. We've got a network of game cameras that are going to take synchronized pictures, probably for the morning chorus and the evening chorus. And then we're developing an algorithm using object classification that can actually give us diversity and abundance numbers for species, bird species, without having to send someone out in the field. This makes it a little bit cheaper in terms of labor costs, and I think it's probably going to be a little more accurate to have basically daily bird counts 2 or 3 times a day as opposed to monthly or quarterly. And these things, you can deploy them and then collect the data quarterly. It's kind of set it and forget it. remembering we have that Texas Flows Fund that will buy the water for interested parties. A provision of accepting that money is that you also agree that you will execute monitoring appropriate to the conservation activity that you are engaged in. And I envision we could have a place where we could say, well, you can contract this monitoring with whoever you choose. However, we've got this vetted technology that can do it at low cost and then offer it to them at cost plus 10% or some, reasonably, probably a discount to a market rate, but a rate that still can generate some income, and that can help us pay our soft cost internally. That would be really a nice add-on. Also, as we had talked about, who is the market? Earlier, there was a great question about who regulates the market, who is doing this? We need an honest broker, right? It could be the university. I don't know that universities are necessarily set up in that vein. Could be a B Corp, but it could be somebody positioned like an NGO that could be that honest broker, and we could charge a fee that's in line with historic brokerage fees. I could see that being a revenue generator. And we also are spinning off a subscription service, a B corporation that is there. We have in Texas some marginalized populations that don't have access to fresh drinking water, and many of them rely on buying bottled water to meet their daily water needs. We are in the process of spinning up Vita Water, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Water Trade that is a benefit corporation that is going to offer on a subscription basis under the sink installation of water filtration to get that marginal water up to drinking water standards. We were able to, if you choose to become a water utility, there's a heavy regulatory lift. So this is a way that we can, again, think creatively, approach these problems by utilizing disruptive business practices that can get us the outcomes we want, and do so in a creative fashion. So these are some of the ways that we are thinking about approaching the problem of being kind of self-sufficient. Okay, let's see, a quick quiz here, if anybody can get this one. Any mathematicians? Upset the apple cart, right? This is just a little side trip, particularly for the theoreticians on the call that are currently professors or professors in practice that are shaping the minds of tomorrow. This is really just to stress the need for us to encourage minds to be creative. I don't think it's reasonable for us to think that the solutions of today will solve the problems of tomorrow. And the more creative, nimble minds we can form, I think we will be in better hands in the future as we begin to move along and do whatever we do after this. So creative thoughts, these are probably not going to work right off the bat, get full disclosure, but in the state of Texas, surface water is owned by the people. The people of Texas own the surface water. It is held in trust by the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They then administer these water rights to individuals. I think you might be able to challenge the system by saying when person A sells a water right to person B, person A often is the beneficiary of a large windfall based on the sale of that personal, what is viewed as a personal property right. However, I wonder if those proceeds really belong to the state of Texas, to the people, because it is really the people's resource that generated that return. And I wonder if you could challenge the status quo under the unjust enrichment clause, or under an argument based on unjust enrichment. I'm not a lawyer, don't know if this would fly. I know that in today's political arena, this probably would not fly, but it's good for us to take creative approaches to thinking about how we might be able to really affect change. One more of these kind of out of left field approaches. Some of you may be familiar with Christopher D. Stone's work. I think it was in the 70s, he pioneered this idea of should trees have standing? Should nature, in the eyes of the court, be an entity that can bring forth a case? If we say yes, and we are married to the idea of prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, it could be argued that the fish and the birds and all the critters were using water long before we did, so they were technically first in line. So maybe we should appropriate a certain amount of water for environmental use and then permit the remainder out to the people. This has actually been adopted in Australia. The environment gets its water first, and then humans divide up what's left. Again, long shot, not even an ice cube's chance, but it's a way to encourage dialogue, encourage nonlinear problem solving, to try to get at these issues, whether it's with water or resource allocation in general, to think about them in creative ways. So eyes to the future. What does the future hold for water markets and regulation of water markets? Generally, I think private enterprise leads the way, and I think that's going to be the case moving forward. I don't think that we can reasonably expect people that have been operating in a framework that governs the regulatory nature and kind of the ideological nature of this resource management to change without some driver that's going to get them to that place. And oftentimes that's private enterprise. Also, again, start with micro markets. We got to think small and then scale, basin by basin, city to rural. We see a lot of that, right? As we see the urbanization of America, and it becomes harder and harder in Austin for people to buy a house, and the city of Austin needs more and more water. Agricultural users are more than ever incentivized to sell their water to the city, and then their land values have actually gone up exponentially because all the middle class who's feeling the property tax squeeze in the urban environments are fleeing to the urban or the rural environments, and we're seeing tract housing go up. Which provides a whole nother set of problems that we then have to deal with. So let's think small and then try to scale it. We also have to remember transmission logistics. I mean, 1 acre foot of water, we talked about how big that is. It's roughly 330,000 gallons and weighs approximately 2 million pounds, right? When we think about the water authority that serves South Connecticut, I think it's 40 million gallons a day. When we start thinking about transmitting large volumes of water long distances, it's going to be a real logistic nightmare. Again, with an eye towards creativity, in Texas, we have a lot of abandoned oil and gas pipelines. If we could run a pig through those, get them clean enough to transmit water, we may be able to co-opt some existing infrastructure to actually make large-scale, long-distance water markets possible. But I think the scarcity is going to have to get to a critical point that forces our hand to do such. And I would encourage all of us to really be intentional by design. We are tip of the spear on some of these issues, and the decisions we make today are going to shape what water management looks like for the ensuing decades and maybe beyond. So it really is in our best interest to make sure we're taking our time and thinking through what the implications of our decisions are. And one thing that I didn't put on the slide, there's a paper in the Texas Water Journal, if anyone is interested, about methodology to price water options. We have to remember that the spot markets, which means cash markets, I buy it, I take delivery right now. That's how much business is transacted. Nobody needs to buy water when it's raining, right? I need the ability to buy water when it's dry, and I don't necessarily want to have to buy water in all the other years. So I think a real flexible tool that we might be able to use would be, they're in place in some municipal settings. They're typically called like dry year water contracts or the take or pay contracts. They have some contracts that kind of look like an option by design, but I think water options would be a very flexible tool that we can use to help us allocate water in times of scarcity. And the last thing I think it's really important to remember when we talk about these things, as a theoretician or as a practitioner, we deal with mountains and mountains of data. And we can make it into pie charts, and we can make it into violin charts and scatter plots, and we can do all this stuff with it. But I think it's fundamentally important for us to remember that this guy is the data point. Behind every data point on all these charts that we make and all the data we look at is a human face and a life. Recently, Mexico was in arrears for its water debt to the United States, and the Mexican president said he was going to make the United States whole on this water debt, and to do so, he was going to shut off the water to the farmers on the northern part of the Mexican border with the United States. This guy, it looks a little bit older. he's got either a stick or a broken garden hoe or something, and he's willing to stand up to the Mexican National Guard because his very life and livelihood is on the line based on the water management decisions that are made. So I think it's really important for us to remember that when we make our resource management decisions, there can be real human benefits to them, but there can also be real human costs to them as well. And I think it really gives a sense of gravity to the situation when we're making hard choices about how our resources are managed. It's always beneficial for me to remember that, and I try to carry it around with me. That's it for today. I really hope I enjoyed being here. I hope you guys got something out of it and enjoyed it for your lunch hour. I appreciate you having me. And looks like we've got about 8 minutes left. We can do a few more questions, or if people want to chime in for discussion, that would be great as well. Whatever you want to do, Marissa.
And so there's a bunch of questions in the chat. If it's okay with you, I'll just rapid fire them at you.
Sure.
So looking to the future, what policy changes do you see as the most important when thinking about making water markets more feasible in Texas?
Oh boy. Well, the first thing we could do is eliminate the junior rights provision. That's the low-hanging fruit, but it requires a legislative change. But there's been some grumblings about that. We could kind of change the way that we do permitting and go to a correlative rights system. In the lower Rio Grande Valley, there is a highly functioning water market where they went in, they adjudicated all the water rights and said, okay, how many shares is this really worth? They came up with a conversion factor for if you're trading agricultural water to city water, what does that mean in translation? I would steer you towards looking at the water master system in the Rio Grande Valley as a really good example of what it could look like. Statewide, we're still with some difficulties regarding just spatial differences in rainfall. But junior rights provision would be that pops into my mind right off the bat.
Awesome. And could you chat a little bit more about the trade-offs of long distance transmissions, kind of what the right scale for transactions is?
Yeah, man, that's a good one too. I think that's the nice thing about relying on markets, right? Like the invisible hand. As these things naturally grow, the scale will grow appropriately with the need of the demand. Although in some strange future world, I could see like a central water bank located centrally in the state, like Dallas, co-opt all the oil and gas pipelines, and everybody has a straw into the bank, and you can make deposits or make withdrawals. That is a very futuristic sounding idea. But if we get to a point where scarcity is such that the only way to get people the water they need is by this long-term transmission, I think the market will take us there incrementally over time. We're a long way from that. But I think, again, to the flexibility of the tool, it allows us to grow as our needs grow and evolve.
Yeah, that's a pretty crazy image to think about, this kind of spider web of water pipes. Taking, I guess, a cue from you on thinking of kind of creative alternatives, someone had asked if something like the Edwards Aquifer model that kind of limits groundwater withdrawals, do you see that ever being applied to other aquifers throughout the state?
That's a great question. And the Edwards, the model is a model of success. And they do have ASR, Aquifer Storage and Recovery, in place. And part of it is that they are the beneficiary of the geology allows for that to happen. So you need to, it's kind of a perfect storm. And San Antonio is also an exceptional model of how water can be managed efficiently. I like the idea of voluntarily offering payments to people to forbear water in times of need. Great example in the Edwards. I think back to what needs to happen to Texas Water to make the markets viable. In addition to junior rights provision, that's kind of surface water. When we talk about groundwater, we really need to have a cap in every conservation district. Markets only work if there is scarcity, right? Things only have value if they're in limited supply. If you have unlimited widgets, they might as well be free. And the way the groundwater is being administered right now, it's a race to the bottom. So if we had true caps on pumping, that would do a lot to preserve that resource and get us to begin to at least manage it more sustainably. I love the Edwards model. It'd be a real hard political sell. I mean, even getting groundwater conservation districts to entertain the idea of caps, it's going to be tied up in litigation for sure.
Yeah, sure. We have two other questions left. One is asking about the kind of issues of hydropower in Texas. I think you mentioned that perhaps expanding hydropower, given uncertainty, doesn't, might not make a ton of sense right now. Do you see hydropower interacting with
that's
your
another
work?
good one. We've got a lot of other alternative energy choices. So I would think that being an expert in the full suite of options available to us, I would think that we would need to bring in folks with some other expertise to give us a comparative advantage case over the other alternatives that are available to us. It's a good diplomatic way of not answering your question, but it's kind of tricky. Like, so out in West Texas at Red Bluff Dam, I'm trying to buy water to send water down the Pecos River, which is totally degraded and extremely saline. They don't have environmental releases of water in their permit, so they can't sell it to me. They do have a permit to use some for hydro generation, which they do, and that does allow for releases of water. So on one hand, I would say, well, at least if we're generating hydropower, we're releasing more water through the dam to at least maintain some riparian flows. However, when we have these the bureaucratic oversight of the dam often is such that in like West Texas, under the current paradigm, they make so much more money off selling water to oil and gas that it becomes difficult to get a real objective, holistic view of management of the resource once it's contained there. So I think we'd have to weigh the merits of the hydro generation against what happens in a big picture once we lock that up in a dam and everything that goes. I mean, dam, you build it, you buy once and you pay forever,
Right. Well, I'm looking at the time now and I don't want to keep people over. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to chat. This was a really interesting presentation. I know someone just put in the chat that, there was a lot of helpful information in there, and I appreciate you kind of also pushing the boundaries of water markets and the last couple of slides that you shared. I just want to hand it off to Angela for a wrap up.
Thank you, Marisa, and thank you so much, Quinn, for joining us today for such a lively discussion with our audience. That'll conclude our webinar on water markets in Texas today. And for our audience, I wanted to remind all of you that to view a recording of this webinar, please visit the events tab on the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website or visit our YouTube channel. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. Until next time, this is Angela Schuett and Marisa Bruno from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. Take care and have a great rest of your day.